Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra deck tech. As promised, I got a couple deck techs lined up for you. This is the next one. So today we're going to talk about Fearsome. I have a few opinions on it, did some testing with it for the tournament, did pretty well with it on ladder, and yeah, I think there are a couple of interesting things to talk about regarding the deck, and then we'll take it to battle in Master as usual to show it off and show you how to play it as best as possible. Alright, before we dive into it, you know the drill. Hit the subscribe button down below. If you haven't yet, just takes a couple seconds. Make sure you don't miss out on future content and helps the channel grow. So it would be really appreciated. Alright, let's dive right in. Okay, so first off, my splash is different from the usual Targon Pale Cascade. So that's probably the first thing we should talk about. The thing is, effectively, I think Pale Cascade's kind of bad in the deck. Like, you wouldn't expect to hear that, because obviously Pale Cascade's a really powerful card. But it's kind of bad in the deck in the sense that it's not that great of an option. Like, it's only as bad as a card that costs 2 and replaces itself can be. But first of all, the deck isn't actually that great at activating the Nightfall in a fair share of situations. Like, first of all, if you open attack, it's often tricky to activate it, because unless you have Risen Mist, you usually can't. Then there will be situations where your opponent has a tech token and opens with like a removal on a unit or like an avalanche, and then if you want to save something, Pale Cascade won't draw you a card either. So these are some of the issues, but that's only like a minor issue. The bigger issue, I think, is that actually +1 health is almost nothing in a deck with mostly 2-cost units and Fearsome. Let me explain why. So the problem is, most of our units have Fearsome and are 2 health. That means they will automatically get in combat with units that have 3 attack or more. A lot of them have 3 attack because either the opponent has 4 attack units and then you Skidra, which leaves them at 3, or you don't, and then most of the units the opponent will be able to block will be 3 attack units, because the majority of units in the game that you usually face are like 3 attack. There aren't that many that are 4, and the units that have 5 or more attack usually like come kind of later in the game. So you often have the situation where your Mistrace, your Horror, or your Skidra or whatever gets blocked by a 3 attack unit, and then you Pale Cascade, all you have is Pale Cascade, and your unit still trades. And since it already trades, it doesn't really do anything. So that leaves you with a much narrower set of situations where you can glimpse, where you can Pale Cascade, and your unit actually survives. Secondly, against stuff like Avalanche and Mystic Shot, sure, Pale Cascade saves the unit, but it leaves it in like a 1 health range, which means it dies to Veil, to Vile Feast, Static Shock, that sort of stuff. So it's much easier to clean up at fast speed for the opponent. Also against cards like Get Excited, Gotcha, and Grasp, for example, or even in some cases Experimenter out of discard aggro. Pale Cascade doesn't save most of your critical units either. So that's kind of a big deal, I found. And that's the problem. Basically, you want your trick to be gaining your board advantage more than like replacing itself. I much rather have my unit survive than have it replace itself with a card in my hand, because this is an aggro deck. It cares more about tempo and about being ahead on board and getting damage in than it does about having like more cards in hand, especially because you have Harrowing that generates a lot of virtual card advantage to sort of overwhelm the opponent anyway. Sure, Pale Cascade cycling helps you to more likely find Harrowings, which is nice, but all in all, I think the impact of a spell that lets you win more combats and survive against more removal is much bigger. So being able to survive 3 damage tricks, 3 damage removal is good, and also after like 2 damage stuff like Avalanche or Mystic Shot, unit still being 2 health and not dying for sort of free to all these deal 1 effects, because the deck basically has no 1 health units other than Onlooker, so basically deal 1 effects on their own don't do anything, they need help from other stuff. which is pretty critical too. So yeah, I think the best option here basically that we have is Sharpsight. Kind of surprising because, especially since the elusive part doesn't really matter that much, but it can matter against Ezreal actually, because if Ezreal attacks, they often get like a Mystic Shot for free and can kill one of your like fearsome units for free, which is a pretty big deal. So being able to Sharpsight there and eat the Ezreal is a pretty big deal. But yeah, otherwise it's mostly just 2 mana plus 2/2. But I think 2 mana plus 2/2 is so much better than the Pale Cascades +2/+1, including the like issues of Pale Cascade sometimes not cycling. That even Sharpsight I think would be a slight upgrade over Pale Cascade in this deck. But I think overall Troll Chant is better. I didn't find the 2 damage from Pale Cascade that crucial in the way the deck plays out. You rarely win like by these super small margins, so because your units are pretty big and hit pretty hard and stuff like that. And I felt Troll Chant is a pretty great compromise. First of all, in combat situations it can often save 2 of your units, which is a super big swing for 2 mana, and in other cases it can maybe make your best unit, like a big Mistrace, immune to an opposing removal spell and shrink their only like fearsome blocker against a deck like Ezreal, for example, where they don't have that many blockers. Because that's the other nice synergy that Troll Chant has, that since it's burst speed and gives minus attack to opponents, it turns off fearsome blockers as well. So it's kind of like a like a 1 unit Skidra type deal. So yeah, I think Troll Chant is probably the best option. Another interesting option would honestly be to just not splash anything at all. I would probably add like a Mark of the Isles, a Glimpse and an Atrocity maybe, or like 2 Atrocity and no Glimpse, or none of these and just add like 3 pings like Horror or Vile Feast. Those are interesting options. They also make sure your Race Caller has 100% hit rate, because while Troll Chant is pretty good, I think there are enough good Shadow Isles cards to not need to splash at all if you want to, because I mean obviously Atrocity has some nice appeal with big Mistwraith, and Mark of the Isles and Glimpse actually do a pretty decent job. The main purpose of Mark is basically to make sure that bigger blockers can't block 2 fearsome units in 2 combats, so basically they block with like a Trundle and like against your 3/2 fearsome, and then you just Mark of the Isles to get rid of it, for example, which is why having some amount of extra attack tricks is relevant, and that's like the biggest weakness, so to speak, of the Troll Chant part, but not that big, given that the Troll Chant still makes sure that your unit survives as well. So while the opponent gets to block twice, they only get to kill 1 unit in the 2 of those blocks, mitigating the impact still for the most part, because they basically have to block the same unit they blocked last time, which is kind of the same as if they had traded with a Mark of the Isles or Pale Cascade, because with Pale Cascade you're almost always trading into bigger units, you're not surviving. While with Sharpsight, there are situations where your unit might survive and kill the blocker that it otherwise neither could have survived nor killed. So these lineup things really matter, and I think that's a big improvement to the deck. I started playing the deck with Pale Cascade initially and was very underwhelmed by Pale Cascade. Effectively, in a lot of situations, Pale Cascade is just basically 2 mana plus 2/0, because the 1 health doesn't make any meaningful difference in keeping your unit alive. And yeah, that's just not as much as you can get out of your trick. The rest is pretty straightforward, so let's talk about the unit. I see some people cutting back on this. It's not the greatest play on turn 1, obviously, but there are matchups where it's still good to have this turn 1, and it's also really, really good in later turns, especially with Stalking Shadow. Pulling double Onlooker can create a huge attack turn for very little mana and overload opposing blocking capabilities very well, especially if they don't have like cheap removal or like mini sweepers like Veil, Static Shock, or Avalanche. So plus the deck has a very low follower count. It has 18 followers for 3 Stalking Shadows, which is like the bare minimum I would recommend. It's already lower than ideal, but there isn't really a better follower to add. But I would definitely not cut followers for spells. Stalking Shadows whiffs more in this deck than any other deck with Stalking Shadows that I played. Also against aggressive opponents, having a 1-drop is pretty huge, and against control opponents too. So basically against mid-ranges where it's not that great turn 1 a lot of the time. Then we just have the usual units, all 3 ofs basically. No, not much explanation needed here. Doom Beast is primarily good because it's like pseudo fearsome in the sense that the drain 2 is kind of like getting 1 free attack in. It's really good with Stalking Shadows. It's good against counter pressure because it gains you health and finishes off opponents. It's just pretty decent. It's a bit awkward sometimes because it isn't fearsome and it messes with your Harrowing sometimes, but all in all, it's worth having. And then yeah, Skidera, Callista, Risen Mist, Racecaller. Risen Mist gives you some really good open attack turns with extra board without having to like skip a beat, which is pretty nice. And yeah, then we just really need to talk about the spells. 2 Mark of the Isles, like I said, if I wouldn't splash, I would probably run 3 to have some amount of combat interaction. It's also pretty decent against removal, like if they on your attack turn try to stat-based removal your unit, you can just Mark of the Isles and still get an attack in with the unit, which is pretty nice. And the fact that it costs 1 is pretty big. Like a lot of the time this card has been better than Pale Cascade in the deck, which seems odd, especially given that the unit dies guaranteed, but at least it's much better against reactive removal, because if they grasp or get excited your unit, Mark of the Isles makes sure it survives and gets the damage in, and that's often all you need really. And when it trades with units, being able to do that for 1 mana is at times better than doing it for 2 and drawing a card, because mana efficiency matters a lot in tempo. Now we have 2 Glimpse. Basically the deck started with 3 Glimpse. I guess 3 Glimpse is reasonable. Problem is the deck isn't that good at using Glimpse. Like you have Elise Spiders to throw away and sometimes, I don't know, blocked Ephemerals when the damage on the opposing unit doesn't matter. But otherwise it's mostly like a reactive Glimpse to opposing removal. So 2 has been decent. The card can be a bit clunky and awkward. And I also really wanted a 3rd Harrowing, but I get into that in a moment, and Glimpse seemed like the best cut. Then 3 Stalking Shadows. I think Stalking Shadows is a bit better than Glimpse. First of all, it's burst, so it doesn't cost an action. It enables Nightfall decently well because of that too. And yeah, drawing double Doom Beast or double Stygian or double Skidera or double Racecaller are all really, really powerful, and even double Mistrace is pretty good. So just kind of a better draw 2 in a way than Glimpse in this deck most of the time. The Troll Chants we already talked about. Risen Mist is basically a unit camouflaged as a spell. And then we have the Harrowing. I see people running 1 or 2 Harrowings, and I think that's just crazy. I think if Harrowing wouldn't exist, the deck wouldn't be a good deck. Harrowing is just the most powerful card in the deck, and all these Harrowing aggro decks have always wanted 3 Harrowing, and Harrowing wins you all the games where your opponent can keep up with you and your normal beatdown wouldn't get the job done, and then you Harrowing and they break because it's too much all at once in 1 turn, and the deck often has good Harrowings on like turn 6 or 7 sometimes already if the opponent is fighting you hard. And yeah, pretty great. One thing to note is in some matchups versus like very board heavy decks like Ash or Targon Invoke and stuff, you might get into situations where your board is full, and if you can override stuff, I would recommend overriding Racecaller, because Racecaller will always be pulled with Harrowing, and that's almost always bad because it's not fearsome and activates all their non-fearsome blockers, while if you override it, your Harrowing will often be like all fearsomes, and it also will increase the chance of Skideras coming back, so all the Skideras you have lost come back, especially if you had like Shadows plus on a Skidera, making it really, really hard for the opponent to block at all. I had some really cool games where Overrode 2 Racecaller against Targon had like a double Skidera Harrowing with only or 5 fearsome units, and the opponent just died. If I had 2 Racecallers in that Harrowing, the opponent would have lived and I would have probably lost that game. So that's like kind of a night minutia to be aware of that comes up, that overriding like bigger non-fearsome units, if you can and have to override something, can be a really good play for your Harrowings. And yeah, just don't play less than 3 Harrowings. It's also what beats like your good matchups that without Harrowing wouldn't be that good, like Go Hard or Ezreal, which are really good matchups, but in big part due to Harrowing, because they are alright at like, they're still a bit unfavored against your non-Harrowing game obviously, but not to a point where they can't beat it. They often could like barely stabilize and then you Harrowing and then they die. So yeah, this is the list. It's really not rocket science. The deck mostly builds itself, but there are a couple of subtleties that I think are worth highlighting, like this 3 Herring and not playing Pale Cascade, I think, is also an improvement. I'm still not 100% sure if Troll Chant is better than Sharpside or No Splash, but I'm fairly confident that Pale Cascade is the worst option, if you ask me. Another interesting option could actually be to run Ionia for like maybe 2 denies and then maybe play a 3rd Mark of the Isles or add like a Nopify or something. But I'd probably try something like 2 deny, 3rd Mark of the Isles if I would want to try deny. That has the benefit of being nice against people that run Veils and Passages and Boxes in their decks, especially in Go Hard. And also improves your matchup against other sweeper heavier controlled stuff. So I could totally see trying that. There's a couple of interesting things to consider, but I think the 95% of the deck kind of built itself and is set in stone, pretty much. So yeah. I guess let's briefly talk about the champions, because I guess Nocturne was a thing before. The problem with Nocturne is really powerful and it's additional Skitterers, which is super good. The problem is Kalista fits the curve a bit better because Skitterer isn't always best used on 3. Doombeast is a terrible 3-drop, so Kalista is like your primary 3-drop, and there will be situations where Skitterer is good on 3, or you just play a 2-drop. But without Kalista, your turn 3 would be much more awkward. Also, Kalista being a big fearsome unit is good for your Herrings. Sometimes she levels, and that's also really powerful. And the problem is the deck is very poor at activating Nocturne. Basically, your only sort of good Nocturne activator is usually Stalking Shadows, and that also requires you to like play nothing on turn 1 and play a 2-drop on turn 3 to have 2 mana banked, which is awkward. The deck's actually not terrible at leveling because of Doombeast, Onlooker, and Shadows on those cards, so it can even sometimes like level it, and he counts for himself as well. But yeah, I think the deck really doesn't want another 4-drop and really wants the 3-drop from Kalista, and Elise is just important to have the 3 2-drops because Mistrace is otherwise sometimes a bit of a weak 2-drop, and you really want the redundancy of having a good 2-drop because you already like don't really have a 1-drop, so you can't really cut Elise either. And I guess some people run Hecarim. Also not really a fan. I don't think you want to go that big. The strength of the deck is that it's actually fairly tempo efficient, creates a lot of stats for little mana with the Myths package, and then you finish off with Herring, and Hecarim really isn't quite what he used to be, so not much of a consideration. Another thing that I've seen people do is run Endure in this deck, and I'm not a big fan. Like, Endure is a good card, obviously, but I think this deck is just not good enough at enduring. If you don't play like throwaway units, like Keeper, that is 2 units from a 2-drop, Aristocrat, that is 2 units from a 1-drop, Caretaker, which is 3 units from a 3-drop, your Endure is just gonna grow very slowly. And in this deck, your Endures will be like medium-sized. By turn 7, they will be like 5, 6, 7. That's not good enough. So can't recommend that. Just too weak. Also, by the time you want to play Endure, you want to play Harrowing. And having 3 Harrowing and 3 Endure in your deck suddenly means you have like 6, 7 drops in your aggro deck, which is not very good. So, because Harrowing is kind of a 7-drop usually in the deck. So can't recommend that either. I think that's all the important thoughts and discussion on the deck. If you have any further questions or suggestions, feel free to let me know in the comments, and otherwise I'll see you in a moment with the games. Stay tuned.